Greetings. I would like to begin what might be called a series documenting the various minor absurdities of our time. Now, in the past, I've sometimes talked about these things, but the name of this series, if you wish to call it that, is Walking on Eggshells. So named because the society we live in is effectively, these days in the West, a walking on eggshell society, a place where each and everything you say can be countered by some piece of lunacy or absurdity, where unfounded claims are made and believed, and where every little thing, no matter how small, is perceived as some sort of form of racism or sexism or whatever. And in this climate, it can only be called walking on eggshells, akin to the kind of person that we've often dealt with in the past, some of us, who really reacts and indeed overreacts to everything, usually in an overly emotive state, and you simply cannot say anything or get a word in edgewise without the person just flipping out. Hence the title, Walking on Eggshell Society. So in this episode of Walking in Eggshells, I'd like to draw your attention to the title of a piece, and I'll be posting a link in the low bar, called When Reality Becomes Fantasy, How Video Games Are Hijacking the Middle Ages. It was posted July 15th in the year of Zeus, that is this year, by the Medievalist Net. Now, first thing that struck me about this so-called article was the abominable grammar and spelling, confusion between the possessive pronoun and contracted it is, as well as lack of subject and verb agreement. So that really didn't turn me on to the article to begin with. But essentially the article describes a PhD project. I imagine this is this woman's dissertation. A woman who studies at the University of Leeds in the UK named Victoria Cooper, and I will quote, "The Middle Ages is a space where white supremacy is legitimized. The maintenance of white privilege. The gamer community uses quote-unquote historical facts to legitimize this kind of literacy." And she goes on to talk about various things and how games are somehow, it's intimated, the product of white supremacists trying to show national feelings or whatever. And she mentions the BNP, the British Nationalist Party, in the context of medieval England and what have you. But what I thought was most interesting was either this woman's profound ignorance or the profound ignorance of the collaborators who've written this article on Skyrim. Now I'll read this bit off because it's really absurd. Video games and medieval history, The Elder Scrolls Skyrim. Skyrim is a massively popular medieval-themed video game, part of the greater Elder Scrolls video game series. Skyrim was released in 2011 by Bethesda Game Studios and was a critical success. Cooper's thesis focused on this game and the way players transpose their heritage and national identity onto the fictitious races of its gaming world. Skyrim is home to the Nords, and then there's in brackets Stormcloaks, a pseudo-Viking race. Tall, fair-haired, and pale, they are a seafaring warrior society that values honor, family, and glory. 34% of the players interviewed picked Nords, the vast majority of which were from Europe and the United States, because they felt an affinity with Nord values and ancestral identity. Players associate themselves with the Nord Stormcloaks because the Imperial soldiers remind them of Roman Britain, and they feel connected to Northern people, their plight, and this sense of Englishness. The Stormcloaks legitimize their cultural heritage. In players who identify as Scottish and Northern English, the Nord's Stormcloaks stimulate a sense of the Northern white nostalgia, and it's ancestrally connected to a medieval place. And she goes on, and anyway. Now, one thing I've noticed is that when people of this ilk, of this sort, start talking about something like Skyrim that they have clearly very little knowledge about, they neglect an entire chunk of a continent called Hammerfell, and they neglect an entire race called the Redguards. For those of you who don't know, there is a major player race called the Redguard The Red Guard is basically a black, dark-skinned race, and it has always been an option in Elder Scrolls games. They are generally considered the most athletic, best warriors on the continent of Tamriel, and they're also skilled at magic and archery. And yeah, it's funny how these people just sort of gloss over this sort of thing. And it's rather incredible that they don't pay attention to all the other things and all the other races. Those of you who know Skyrim or the Elder Scrolls know that there are several races. You have the man races, the human races, the Nords, the Bretons, the Red Guards, the Imperials. You have the beast races, the Khajiit and the Argonians, respectively, cat and lizard people or reptilians. And you have the mare, the elven races, the dark elves, the wood elves, and the high elves. All alternatively, the Dunmer, the Bosmer, and the Altmer. So into this mix, you really get quite a bit of variety, and there's a complete omission of this in the article. And frankly speaking, if people feel that they can identify with the Nords' plight in Skyrim and their rebellion against the Empire, who fucking cares? And once again, walking on eggshells. This isn't about legitimizing white nationalism or anything. Some people feel that way. I, who feel connected to no ethnicity and nothing, I've played everything. I've played female characters. I have almost 4,000 hours of Skyrim. I played female characters. I've played every race, although some more frequently than others. I'm a fan of Argonians and orcs. I forgot to mention the orcs. There you go. The Ozmer, the orcs. And I've played everything. I've even played a Stormcloak Nord nationalist before just to see what it's like, even though I have no political leanings or inclinations towards that. And to accuse Bethesda, subtly at least, she doesn't actually make a real official accusation of somehow supporting some white nationalist agenda is just absurd. We often forget, and I think these people, these SJWs, tend to forget that the best kind of fantasy is very often the fantasy that takes real conflicts that we face in our world and transposes them to the fantasy world. So, of course, there is some resemblance in the world of Skyrim and the Stormcloak and rebellion to perhaps people under the yoke of the Roman Empire, and where the Imperials are representative of the Romans in some vague sense. They also have their ascended man god, Talos. Talos, in some vague sense, resembles a sort of Jesus Christ figure, part man, part god. Much like in the Roman Empire, for some period of time, Christianity was outlawed, and hence the worship of the so-called Jesus. And in like manner, due to a pact and concordance with the Altmer, the High Elves, specifically the Thalmor, the quote-unquote evil empire from the south, Talos worship is banned, and they're all up in arms about this. And these are not real-life things, but of course they're informed, at least in part, by history and real-life events and conflicts that tend to affect us human beings in the real world. And there's nothing wrong with that. No fantasy game would be successful or would sell if it just willy-nilly made stuff up that had no relationship whatsoever to human beings in the real world. We find fantasy stories compelling and interesting, and stories that draw us in. All these qualities, we find them fantastic because we can relate to them. And if there's some Scottish guy who can relate to the Nords' plight against the Empire, who fucking cares? Good for him. He's getting something out of the game, and it's bringing him a sense of pleasure and enjoyment. And most importantly, it's a fucking fantasy game. So whilst, of course, these games include many similar real-world plights and dilemmas and what have you, it doesn't mean they're actually happening in the game. The Nords are not, white supremacists. In fact, any race can join the Nord Rebellion, the Stormcloaks as they're called, and In theory, though, if you look in the armies, yeah, most of the time they are Nords, but even if that's the case, so what? Fantasy literature and fantasy games, and ranging from Dungeons and Dragons to much more modern computer RPGs, have had a long history of having multiple races and racial conflict. Anyone who's ever played Dungeons and Dragons and is familiar with the Forgotten Realms, we know in that fantasy realm that there are conflicts, for example, between human beings and the quote-unquote demi-humans, the halflings, the gnomes, the dwarves, and the elves, in particular with the elves. This is nothing new. J.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, the elves are different from humans, and there is suspicion, and this is true of almost every fantasy setting I'm familiar with. I'm familiar with many. This is nothing new. This is the hallmark of fantasy, different racial groups in conflict with each other, and so we have this in the Elder Scrolls as well. It is absolutely absurd on the part of these people to try to sort of pigeonhole certain aspects of some game because there's a nationalist, ostensibly white nationalist rebellion occurring in Skyrim against the Empire. I mean, who fucking cares? Even if that were accurate, it's still a fantasy game. And once again, to hammer home the point, the best fantasy is the fantasy that is not too far removed from our reality, in as much as it includes the real-life conflicts we've known from history and in our current age, and the problems and dilemmas we face as human beings, but also includes the fantastical elements we've come to know, such as magic, enchanted weapons, dragons, vampires, or whatever. Combining all these things together is what you get as far as a recipe is concerned for a really, really good fantasy or high fantasy game, or low fantasy for that matter. You can't have one without the other. If you take all the fantastical elements out, you don't really have fantasy anymore. If you take the real world things out, the realism and what have you, you don't really have a compelling story, and you don't have compelling conflicts, and you have basically nothing. So these people, as usual, in our walking on eggshell society, are missing the forest for the trees. It is standard procedure by now. They're not paying attention to the details. Look at all the other races you can play in Skyrim. You can play orcs, you can play high elves, you can play wood elves, you can play dark elves, you can play red guards, which are black men and women. You can play different types of humans, such as Imperials or Bretons, which are half elves in some way, and you have a lot of options. You can play a fucking lizard man and a cat man as well. They don't pay attention to that. They just focus on, well, lots of people like playing Nords, and that's true. I've known people, I have almost 4,000 hours clocked in Skyrim, and over the 4 years, more or less 4 years that the game has been out, I've talked to many people, and yeah, a lot of people like playing Nords, and some people even exclusively. I've never been that way, but it's their game, and it's their fantasy, and if they want to play just a Nord, go for it. I find that boring. In fact, Nords are probably the least interesting race to me. I prefer beast races and elven races, particular orcs, but whatever. So the other thing that should be mentioned is that these people in their walking on eggshell society are trying to crush the creative juices of just about everyone. It's also mentioned in this silly article, for example, that there's some sort of systematic attempt to claim that women have never been warriors, and in all likelihood, most of them were not. I can't imagine a woman in a medieval setting running around with a claymore and being able to wield it with the same proficiency as a man. And supposedly this is sort of institutionalized sexism. Never mind the fact that in Skyrim, just as you can play multiple races, you can play man or woman. You can play female or male. You've always had that option in Elder Scrolls games, and Skyrim is no exception. And whatever the next title for Elder Scrolls is, and I'm looking forward to it, should I still be alive, it's going to be the same principle. So when they rant on about sexism and racism, given the huge diversity in the Elder Scrolls universe, in particular in Skyrim, The fact that you can play a dark-skinned person, you can play a light-skinned person, you can play a fucking lizard man or a lizard woman, they don't have a fucking clue. And these people are supposedly gamers, although it's not explicitly stated that this Cooper person is a gamer, but man, she really needs to do her research a lot better because she doesn't have a fucking clue. And like I said, it's a fantasy. I've played a Stormcloak nationalist before. I've played a downtrodden Argonian that hated the Stormcloaks for the way that the Stormcloaks treated the Argonians and rebelled against them. I've played a High Elven vampire that tried to infiltrate the Stormcloaks and take control of them. I've played just about everything you can imagine. I played an orc that pragmatically thought that allying with the Stormcloaks would be better because they would be left in peace. I mean, it's a fantasy game, so it's your fantasy. You create a character, you give them your thoughts, your actions, etc., and you build the character the way you want it. That is the nature of fantasy. The combination of well-done fantastical elements such as magic and supernaturalism and supernatural abilities and in the case of medieval setting, weapons such as great axes and great swords and different materials such as dragon bone and what have you, and realistic elements based on human conflict, human interaction, different racial groups. Not everyone gets along in the real world, and of course in the fantasy world, not everyone gets along either. So, lords and ladies, the time has come to raise our goblets in rebellion to this absurdity and the walking in eggshell society that we currently live in. So I will in the future be making more walking on eggshells videos because this is the state of the union, effectively. Walking on eggshells. You can't say anything, can't do anything, you can't produce anything without making somebody upset over some absurd reason that most of the time isn't even accurate, as was the case with this article. Once again, link is in the low bar, and I will check you guys out later. As always, may Talos watch over you. Bye-bye.